Good morning and welcome everybody to the Festival of Arts and Ideas. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is not so much known in the broader audience, and that is cultural preservation. So within cultural preservation, there's many different areas, many different topics when you talk about the arts, spirituality, emotional, physical well-being. There's many topics to cover. So today I want to open up with just one question, and that is when you hear the topic of cultural preservation, what ideas or what thoughts actually come to mind? And I'll pose this to maybe Sandy first, Professor Grande.
Thank you. So, in some sense, it gives me pause to talk about ourselves and our peoples in the register of preservation. I always think like we're not strawberries or something to put in a can in your fridge or on a shelf. And I think that kind of contributes to the idea that we're only historical peoples to be preserved, or that our cultures and traditions don't change over time, just like everybody else's. But we're all living cultures, living traditions. People obviously living in the here and now, as this panel suggests, and contribute to, be grounded. I think who we are is always defined by, primarily, first and foremost, the lands that we're all born on, which are all different lands. We're global peoples. We're, peoples that span throughout, all the various areas of arts and culture, from like really vibrant jazz musicians to people who work in museums. You'll be able to hear from a couple of us today. And so that's a grounding, but again, we continue to live in the contemporary world just like everybody else. So just would like to underscore that traditions and histories always evolving along with who we are as peoples.
Thank you. Nakai, you want to go first? Or
Sure,
second?
sure. How I look at cultural preservation is really cultural continuation. It's not something that has stopped. It's something that has been going on for generations and generations. It's something that will continue to go on, and the way that we maintain and preserve them is by doing them. And the more that we're introduced to it, the more that we're able to help it grow so that future generations can have easier access. I feel like uh, between all of us, all the work that we do, in the back of our minds is always how this is going to make it easier for the next generation coming up, how we can help preserve and discover informations that they don't have to go and read all day long and dig through books and read old English and old Dutch. And we can work on traditional designs. We can restore basket practices in the region. Our language revitalization program in Mashantucket, where our young ones are being immersed in the language every day. There's new signage going up all over reservations, so it's right in our faces and something that's not going to go away. So for me, it's really about the continuation of culture.
I love that. That's actually really good. Chris, you want to go next?
Sure. When it comes to cultural preservation, for me, it really goes back to my childhood. I'm, a second generation cultural preservationist, and in a lot of different ways. I do it differently than my father did. He focused largely his entire life's work on preserving our language and preserving our music. And because of that, I have the tools that I need to work on our history. And so I use all of those tools as an educator. And so cultural preservation for me is not just about keeping things preserved like a snapshot in time. Like Sandy talked about the dynamic nature of our cultures, and how Nakai talked about the multi-generational thinking. I agree with both of those points and follow those in my work. It's really about the world that we leave behind for that next generation that follows us. And what I was always taught by my grandmother growing up in a Passamaquoddy speaking household, and learning that English is a foreign language to this land and normalizing that for people, is that our purpose in life is to leave this world better than we found it. And that's one of the things that motivates my work with cultural preservation.
Thank you for that. So, interestingly enough, we all come from different areas and different facets within our lives, and we actually hold multiple roles. But let's talk a little bit about the work that we do in cultural preservation. What exactly are you doing, and what type of things? Nakai, you kind of spoke to it a lot as far as the community, what the community is doing. Can you kind of expand on that just a little bit more?
So, Mashantucket is, I feel, in a really beautiful space right now. It's really promising to see more and more family are taking the initiative to be involved in culture, and that's not something that everyone has to do. You don't have to be a traditional singer to be a tribal member. You don't have to be a traditional dancer. You don't have to be a basket maker. That doesn't make you any less Pequot or indigenous. So, seeing people take the initiative and take the drive to come out is really huge. And we have weekly singing and dance practices. We have weekly language classes. The community is coming together and making moccasins together. They're learning how to bead, weekly beading classes. The community has really stepped up and made culture available for the people who can't easily access it. And that's really huge. And that's a lot of what I get to work on daily, which is amazing. I'm also a father to 3 Pequot children. So it's a way of life. For me, this is all I've ever known. I don't know any different, so I can't speak of any different. I grew up in this life, and it was passed on to me, and I get to do the same thing, and I feel extremely fortunate for that.
I like that you talked a little bit about, the generational growth that you're doing, whether it's teaching the children, bringing it on, sharing your knowledge as well. Sandy, I know that you have a different perspective, even from, a westernized and elders perspective. Can you share a little bit about, the work that you're doing and kind of how it's affecting your community?
So as a professor of political science at the University of Connecticut, I think mostly around, so culture always exists in a context, right? Right here in these lands, we're in the seat of genocide. Literally the Treaty of Hartford, if you don't know it, familiarize yourself, but it's one of the few documents turned to anywhere in the U.S. Historically, that's where the call to genocide is actually recognized. And so when you're in the seat of genocide and there's annihilation of Pequots and the other peoples of this land, that's where kind of ideas of preservation, I think, come from. When you're close to being annihilated as a people, there's a lot of recovery. So in my work with, I think, multi-generational, but in terms of my students, so I make sure that when they come into my classroom at the University of Connecticut, that they know whose land they're on. They know the history of those peoples. I don't think you should be able to graduate from any institution in the state of Connecticut, K-12 through university, college, graduate school, without knowing where you are in the history of the land that you're on, and the peoples that are continuing here. That should be a foundational aspect of all of our education. And then I will say, so I'm Quechua, I left that out of my bio, but we're also global peoples and come from really different histories. So, my peoples are in the highlands, and so had, as another context, we have over 10 million speakers of our language. So, so a very different kind of history relationship to the forces of colonization. So that enables a whole different kind of life. And so understanding that, we're global peoples, everybody has a different history, everybody has a different relationship to colonization, but we all struggled against it historically and continue to struggle against those forces now.
Thank you. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I get a lot of labels for the different work that I do, but primarily I call myself an educator, and that's something that my father did as well. And when it comes to the work of cultural preservation, it's really about using all of those different tools, to put together for education, whether it's education of ourselves or whether it's sometimes education of our allies, the outward world. And for me, Currently, right now, I work at the University of Connecticut with Sandy, and very blessed to be there. And when I think about Native students having to leave their cultural background, which is at home, and then have to come to the Colonial University, University of Connecticut, how I can do what my father did as a mentor for many college students going through the college experience, not lose who they are while they are there, and for to keep to hold the institution accountable, to make sure that they don't get too arrogant to understand the richness of our knowledge and who we are, and so that therefore those students feel welcome and find a place there, and that way they can graduate, with the degree, as well as a grounding in their cultural background. And that to me is an important step in this modern day world, where college degrees are, help students achieve success in their life and help them achieve their dreams, and making one of those safe spaces at the University of Connecticut. That's one of the things that I'm really passionate about these days.
That's wonderful. So it's interesting because, you kind of alluded to some of the challenges and issues and problems. Sandy, you talked about, colonization and cultural genocide. And I know that there are some laws and regulations that actually have come into place. There's a lot of lobbying around the world that are trying to open up spaces for Native peoples. What are some of the obstacles and challenges that you're facing within the work that you're doing? And whether that is generational or, educational related, what are some of the challenges that you're facing? Chris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, for me, I grew up in the state of Maine, what is now currently the state of Maine. It's only been the state of Maine for 204 years. It's Wabanaki territory. And up in that territory, it's a lot more remote, and we are a lot more prominent, I guess, in the minds of our neighbors, the state of Mainers. And when I moved down here to Connecticut, what I realized is that this area loves its colonial history, to the point that it has erased natives nearly completely, from the story of what we now call the state of Connecticut. And as you heard in the land acknowledgement, the word Connecticut is a derivation of an Algonquin word that describes the river.
Connecticut.
Exactly. So it is not, from an indigenous perspective, that word describes the river and all the people that are dependent upon it. And that includes Abenaki people way up north. And that includes the tribes down here on the southern end of it as well. And it does not describe the boundaries that we have today. And so breaking through that minutia, right, for people, to get them beyond thinking 200 years, which is how the education system taught them, that, explorers got here in the 1400s, and time started there. That's one of the things trying to undo for people, and requires unlearning. And so somebody has to be willing to do that. And you have to create spaces where unlearning can happen so that we can re-educate with inclusive Native history as part of it as well.
Thank you. So the names are kind of, one of those things that culturally around Connecticut, around the nation, there's names that have been adopted, different states that are named after it. Nakai, you talked a little bit about on the reservation how even the signage is starting to change to bring in the culture, to bring in some of the names. Can you talk a little bit more about the challenges that you're facing in doing the work and the natural elements around, your organization, around the roles that you play, and really the challenges that you're seeing within your own community?
Absolutely. So my community fought in the very first war against the English. And so we're really ground zero for a lot of policies and protocols that go on after with how to deal with indigenous people in this region. Reservation systems start right here in Connecticut. The Pequot War is the reason we're Connecticut today and not Massachusetts. Going through a chartership and a petition for that through the narratives of Mason, Gardner, and Underhill, the King of England said that the Pequot War was a just act, and it was God's will for them to have this land because of that. So that all stems from that. So colonization is so deeply rooted here. The roots of it start right here. And so it is incredibly hard to deal with sometimes. And as we go on through history, I often think of my ancestors who, through the Treaty of Hartford, were forbidden to speak their language, were forbidden to call themselves Pequots, forbidden to live on their land. We can do all of those things freely today. So I don't have much to complain about as challenges as much, but there is still a lot because of the generations that didn't get to participate in their culture because that culture put a target on their back. That culture affected their livelihood and who they were as individuals. So people leaving the reservation, people having to live in towns like Norwich and Westerly, and not be on their homelands with their families. And then the mistreatment of indigenous people throughout, with overseers coming into play and census reports labeling Pequot people throughout their life as white, black, indigenous, red, mulatto, and they're the same people. They're not shapeshifters or anything like that, that we know of. But there's so much, hundreds and hundreds of years in this area of colonization. And of course, you get to the final parts of colonization, and it's when people start doing it to themselves. Right. We're in a world now where we have to use colonized tools to decolonize. We have to take the time to create different standards and different policies and procedures to work with different institutions like UConn, like Yale, to say, all right, this is how you guys have done it, but this is how we're going to do it moving forward. We can do this and collaborate. Our people have always been a people to share. If you look at old records, if you read old documents, our people have always been a giving people. We just want to go through our processes and our procedures in a way that we can honor what we're working on. And that's really important. I think that's the biggest challenge, is getting a lot of institutions, places to come play ball with us, but understand that we have a seat at the table too.
So what I'm hearing is that there's some protocols and challenges that you're facing when you go into institutions, and it's about just doing things the way they've always been doing it, and then kind of welcoming a new way or a new perspective, a broader perspective. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the holding of objects and looking at the people and saying, well, we can take care of it better than you can. But I came into your living room and took it out. It's mine now, though. It's ours, but it can stay at my house.
I've discovered it. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that historical perspective, because I think that that's really, really important. And when we view, people of indigenous descent and our first peoples, that there is an ideal that they come in with. There's a thought that they come in with, how you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to present. So, Professor Grande, can you give a little bit of perspective about the work that you're doing and the challenges that you're facing?
Everybody else, I think it's really the erasure, like the almost complete erasure of indigenous peoples in the state of Connecticut. Lots of places, but it seems really profound here, particularly profound. But when you're starting, as Nakai was talking about, a history of annihilation here, where under penalty of law you couldn't say the word Pequot. You were allowed to kill Pequots on site. I mean, that's a really intense history to come back from, or to live through. I shouldn't say come back, but to live through. So when you go into Pequot territory, Mohegan territory, similarly, and see the vibrancy there, it's really profound and touching. So, again, when students come into my classroom, many are not even students. I would say other staff and administrators often don't know that there's still Native peoples in the state of Connecticut or anywhere. Still don't know much about the cultures or the history. So you're starting from scratch, and that's always a real challenge. That said, I have to say, students especially are really responsive. They often get upset that they didn't know, why am I in college and nobody ever told me this before. The only thing I learned in school was about, some myth about Thanksgiving, and they don't really understand. And the last thing I'll say is I try to say it's important for everybody, if you're a citizen in the state of Connecticut, you should know this history and the contemporary realities, but not just to learn about, but to figure out what are the implications for everybody's lives today. What does it mean for all of us, for these languages to have nearly been released, or these cultures, traditions, ways of knowing and being to have been released? especially when we're facing, as a world, challenges like climate change. What have we all lost by erasing certain peoples off, trying to erase certain peoples off the face of the earth? And, that hopefully gets them motivated to engage in lots of different ways, because they realize that the implications are clearly profound for Indigenous peoples in our communities, but I think they're profound for everybody across the board.
Thank you for that. So it's interesting because you kind of alluded to this as well, and the fact that, we are all part of different sovereign nations. We come from different perspectives. And I think it's, a whole, when we talk about Indigenous people, there's always usually one or, two images that come to mind, some of the Hollywood stereotype, but there are close to 600 federally recognized tribes. There are thousands of state recognized tribes, and there are tens of thousands of sovereign nations around our nation just alone. And we're not even, referring to the First Peoples of Canada. So, that also poses some of a challenge to people who are coming in and expecting things to be a certain way, to have certain laws, to deal with, our generations in a certain way, or educate in a certain way. And when you talk about, students that actually come in to the university saying, why am I first hearing this? I've never heard this before. It may or may not be the way that they've actually grown up in their culture, whether that's on the East Coast or the West Coast, the Plains and the Great Lakes. So I know that, we've come a long way and we're doing the work. So can we talk a little bit about some of the successes that we've seen, some of the successes that we've had within our work that we're actually doing? I see your big smile. So Professor Grande, you want to start us off on, what is some of the things that really bring you joy and the successes that you're seeing in your own work and around the nation?
So I'm part of the first Native Studies cohort hire faculty at the University of Connecticut. We came in 2020, so in the middle of the pandemic.
Wait, hold on. The first
ever
in 2020.
Yeah. And so I don't know if they knew what they were doing when they hired us. I think they thought we were just gonna, be professors the way everybody else is a professor and just happen to be Native or Indigenous or do Indigenous studies. But I think all of us came from a perspective of understanding that the university needed to change. And I'm smiling because so far, knock on wood, everything we've brought to their attention, there's been lots of responsiveness, and not just responsiveness in terms of support, but actual material support, putting resources toward the efforts that we're engaged in. And I can talk a little bit more about it later, but probably one of the biggest projects right now that we're all involved in different ways and have been in part of conversations is there's a UConn campus, Avery Point. I don't know if any people have been over there, but it's a beautiful campus.
The beautiful shore.
Right on the waterfront in what is now, is that Groton, Connecticut? But it's traditional lands of the Pequot people, right? So been given the green light to reimagine UConn Avery Point as a Native serving institution / kind of tribal college, and we're weeks away from formalizing the first memorandum of agreement between the 5 tribes in the state of Connecticut and the university to move forward in a good way, where we're equal partners around the table, or everybody has, equal stakes and equal say. It'll be historic if it all happens. Please put good wishes in the world for us. It'll get voted on in September.
Well, we want that vote to go through, because that would actually, make sure that we're having access to a broader audience as well. So that's beautiful. Nakai, what are some of the things that you found, to be successful? What are things that you're seeing in your work and around, the nation that are actually bringing you joy?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to work at an amazing institution that provides Indigenous perspectives from Indigenous voices. So I feel extremely fortunate in the work that we get to do each and every day, because students are everything. That next generation is everything. So it's so common. And me and Chris started at the museum on the same day, and it went into a closure. And then me and Chris were the only two. We were the new guys, and then we were the only guys. And we would spend days doing back-to-back tours, doing a tour, running a group back upstairs, grabbing another one, going back down. But you get to provide a new perspective, and one that is hidden. And we have an opportunity now with curriculum within the state through the mandate to help make it more accessible to people. But just getting children to come to the museum, college students come to the museum, and they come and learn these histories, and they're like, well, why wasn't I taught this? Why am I just hearing this now? And that's such a common theme that we see. So it's amazing to have that platform to be able to do that. But right now, the big thing that we're working on is making it more accessible. And the collaborations between the tribal communities has been a beautiful thing in this region. There's a lot of history, and there's a lot of hostilities throughout that history because, like we said earlier, we identify ourselves as sister nations. I can't name a sibling group that doesn't fight. So we have disagreements, but to come together for the greater good of all of our people, to be able to not let English authors and Dutch authors tell our stories, but to really tell a complete story and have the opportunity to share those perspectives, but also have ours right there as a primary source as well. So the work of creating more primary sources, having an awesome establishment to be able to share these histories on such a large scale, and then collaboration, because at the end of the day, we're seeing more relationships start to form. And that's the core of who we are as a people. We rely on relationships with one another, relationships with our family, with the land, our spirituality. So at the end of the day, we don't do well in isolation. We need collaboration. And that's something we're starting to see more and more. I'd say the past 5 years, we've had more people reach out and want to do more than just check a box.
I like that. So opening up to the generations, starting with the children, bringing in sister tribes, collaboration around the nation, these sort of things that I know as a younger person, I didn't see, things that they're seeking out, but now these resources are starting to become available and public, sharing beyond just our communities, but also, to anyone who's actually interested in knowing and seeing. So Chris, what are your thoughts on, the things that make your heart sing, the things that you're seeing, your successes that you're encountering?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. When I was a very young person, I thought that, science and engineering were the way to go because my father loved technology. Even though he was a cultural preservationist, he loved to use technology to do so. And I started at Dartmouth College with that in mind. And I had an experience in a music class that kind of changed my life right there. And because what I realized is that what takes science sometimes decades for us to accept and learn, you can affect and change somebody's life with arts and the humanities in an instant. And so I had, I left Dartmouth and I became a Mystic River singer. That's how I ended up in Mashantucket with the Nakais and all the family there. And I have children there. And I started working at the Pequot Museum. And one of the things I found about that museum is that it has exactly that same power. Within 1 hour tour, you can literally change a person that was born and raised here in Connecticut's perspective from, uninformed to nearly completely informed about the history of this landscape from a Native perspective. And it's very powerful to see the shift in a person when that happens. However, it was not uncommon for even an adult to be on tour and to raise their hand and innocently ask, are the Pequot still alive? They're just not putting two and two together because all of what Connecticut told them throughout their entire life is that the Pequots are dead and gone. Yet they're right there leading the tour, right? And so that affected me greatly. And so as a visitor to this territory and somebody that's raising children here, I felt that something had to be done. And luckily I found two other colleagues at the Pequot Museum that believed in the same thing. That's Indana Spears, who's a member of the Dene, Ojibwe, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and lives with the Narragansett peoples, and Dr. Jason Mancino, who's the former executive director. And after our time at the Pequot Museum, we came together in this work and came together as Agamaw Educational Initiative. And we've had a lot of success in education in this state. Not only do we create educational resources for ourselves to give out to people, but we've worked with the Department of Education on creating new social studies standards, as well as help them implement or do the work that needs to be done to work with the tribes to implement the the Native Studies mandate that is here in Connecticut at this time.
So the educational perspective of it, showing that you're working within sister tribes, you're working within generations, that you're actually sharing the education that's actually going part of it.
Absolutely, yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because one of the other things when we talk about the school systems that we are in, it's not very, rare. One of the school systems that my daughter is a part of, they will ask, does anybody actually know an Indigenous person? Have you ever met an Indigenous person within your life? And everybody will usually say no, absolutely not. And then they turn and say, well, we have one, we have an Indigenous student with us, today that's going to be with us for the rest of the school year. And everyone's like, yeah, I know that kid, but you don't know. You don't necessarily see it. You don't necessarily know who's actually Indigenous, who has that birthright and who doesn't. But within, the educational system, within the Pequot Nation, within Yukon, we're educating people as to what these various Indigenous perspectives are actually all about. So I know, and I see some, even amongst the audience that we have today, we're wondering, what's the call to action? What could we do? What are some resources that we could do to continue to educate ourselves on the idea of cultural preservation, making sure that we are extending our knowledge? Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, thankfully, I've been able to work in a lot of different aspects, and there are some resources that are available for free. You can go to agamaut.org, and you can find a guide to English language terminology for Indigenous peoples. That's downloadable for free. But I also have worked in film. I was the senior advisor to the Emmy-winning film Dawnland, which chronicles the Wabanaki TRC. So learning about that very real, recent history, very present history within Wabanaki communities, those are available for free, as well as Wet'suwet'en. And then I've also done some writing. And if you want to look at the Thanksgiving story that you probably were born and raised with about, Pilgrims and Native having a great time together, I wrote a book for Scholastic called If You Lived During the Plymouth Thanksgiving, which was done with the idea of bringing Wampanoags into the present, not just writing about them in the past, and
So we all
making
weren't
sure.
sharing turkey and cranberries all together in a happy.
No, it didn't quite go like that, right? Yeah, no.
But just making it available.
It could be a whole speech right there about how different it was, and
we'll have you come back in the fall.
Yeah. So that book is out there. It's by Scholastic, and a lot of teachers over the last 3 years have implemented it into their curriculum and used it as a way to teach about that encounter in a more inclusive way that talks about not just the one friendly encounter, but also the good, bad, and ugly that happen along the way.
Thank you. Nakai, you talked a little bit about, the family perspective. What would you like to see people coming in and doing? What would you like to see people's perspective and what they're doing within even the museum?
I strongly encourage anyone to come take a trip to the museum and come spend some time. I'm pretty easy to find. You'll see a big guy walking around through exhibits somewhere. But come and spend some time. That's what we're there for. And right now, this region in general is just full of so many amazing resources. We have so many amazing family members, friends, and colleagues that are such amazing resources, and we're all relatively local. And it's extremely an amazing thing for us to be able to share our histories. Being able to come up here and have the opportunity to speak with all of you today is an awesome opportunity. And my call to action would be to take the time to build a relationship. I wouldn't always say expect that relationship to happen overnight and that tribal communities are just going to drop everything and want to just run towards you, but take the time to build a relationship, because there are so many amazing opportunities. Like I said, we are open and willing to share our histories, our life ways. And another really important thing that I've heard chimed on a bit today is, we're here today. We're living a modern life. If you go on Google right now and if you typed in Italian American, it would show someone from today, or African American, it's going to show someone from today, Asian American, so on and so forth. If you type in Native American, it's going to show a picture from 200 years ago, 300 years. You're going to see someone not dressed like how we are, sitting right in front of you. So there's always that romanticized view. Take your time you're doing it now by being here, but take the time to get some education in these subjects and come have a conversation with us. We're always willing to have a conversation.
I like that. So picking up some books, just spending some time, coming to the museum, doing your own research. Sandy, what would you like to see people doing?
Yeah, I totally support what both Chris and Nakai have already offered in terms of like spend time to educate yourself, for sure, show up. There's lots of spaces in which Native peoples are, and the showing up is a first part of building relationships, but they take time. And so I guess to those two things, I would just add advocate. We all talked about erasure as the biggest challenge, and erasure is everywhere. Wherever you're working, wherever you're, congregating with other people, whatever kind of space that is, there's always a way. Chances are Native peoples won't be in that space, so you have to advocate for us to be in those spaces. This is the International Festival of Arts and Ideas as just one example. So if we're really think about internations, and there's over 500 nations, federally recognized nations in the U.S., then there should be, broader representation of Native peoples here. There's, I'm all about Indigenous Native jazz right now, so I keep mentioning this, but, Amalio Bomswin is an amazing Abnaki jazz fusion. This woman, Julia O'Keefe, has a all Indigenous big band. Like, I would love to see these peoples and the various arts and cultures, not just powwow dancers, but that's really important. But, the broader diversity of who Native peoples are everywhere. If you work in government, if you work, it doesn't really matter, health, social work, education, whatever sphere that you're in, there's Native peoples doing the work somewhere. So advocate. On my own campus, because Native peoples in what we now call the U.S. is around 1% of the population. Anytime you see educational statistics, you'll often not see the Native category at all, or you see an asterisk, like too small to count. And I, anytime that happens on my own campus, I said, I don't care if it's zero, if it's, at one point Native faculty 0. I want to see it up there and the 0. It doesn't matter if they're, if you didn't, we didn't collect that data, then people should know that we didn't collect that data. So even when there is an erasure that's profound to acknowledge, we should still be able to see the erasure visibly, so we know that we have work to do.
Thank you for that. We definitely do have work to do. When you're thinking about resources around the world, we're coming up on the summertime. People are traveling. We're going all across the world, all across the nation to different communities. Take some time, visit the local tribal communities, spend your money in some of these stores and some of the museums, and spend your time to just get to know a different culture. I guarantee you that you will be elevated from that experience. So I want to thank you all very, very much for being with us today. I know that, even from a healthcare perspective, we talk about the impact of COVID, the impact of respiratory diseases, the impact of diabetes and lupus within our own communities. Are there any final thoughts you want to share on cultural preservation?
Okay, I'll begin. When it comes to cultural preservation, like I said, it's really about the multi-generational thinking. When it comes to this work, I watched my father do it his entire life. I watched him grow up from a time when everybody spoke Passamaquoddy in the household. 100% of the community was Passamaquoddy speaking, till by the time of his death, he saw that percentage go down to less than 20%. And his work was language preservation primarily. And the reason why is we got electricity in our homes in the 70s. His generation group, was born at home and grew up with no electricity, no running water. And so our language, even though we're one of the most eastern tribes in this country, was preserved in that space. However, with the advent of electricity, we had English-speaking media come into our homes. And when we had to go to the BIA school, we had to learn in English nearly 100% of the time. So my generation became the first generation to grow up speaking English first. Instead of Passamaquoddy first as a secondary, and so one of the things that I want people to remember about this work is that you may not live to see your intended outcome, but that does not mean you don't do the work. My father's work has elevated to a 20,000 entry dictionary, and we are now in the second printing with another 1,000 entries. And so the Passamaquoddy Maliseet language is one of the most documented indigenous languages in this country. And so therefore we have all of the tools to start full immersion with the kids and turn that percentage around, and finally get it to it, sadly, after his life. But here I am carrying on his work, making sure to do what I can to support it. And so just remember that this is multi-generational work, and that what you do today affects the generations of tomorrow, and you can affect them in a positive way, and really go for that.
So language preservation, even just speaking one word, growing up and trying to look at your resources and see what's available. Any final thoughts, Nakai?
Yeah, chiming right in with Chris, that is 100% the space that we find ourselves in. Is the work that we do today, we're never going to see the end of it because it doesn't have an end. We can get to really good spaces and we can get to a point, but this is something that, like I said, how I started off, continuation, cultural continuation. This is not a work that we're ever going to see the end of the road in, but we're, like I said, really fortunate now to be seeing some of the fruits of the labor of generations before us, and how they made it easier for us and inspired us to do the work that we're doing. I've been extremely fortunate to have amazing role models throughout my life who have given me the opportunity to even be sitting here today to be having a conversation. I'm a 30-year-old kid from Mashantucket who was always shy and quiet, but I loved my people and I love who I am, and nothing makes me more proud. And when my community called upon me and looked to me for information and gave me opportunity to learn and grow, having the opportunity to work with Trudy Lamb Richmond, the opportunity to work with Chris, with Dr. J, to work with Adonis, to work with Tony Whedon, to spend time with my elders, sitting and being a fly on the wall, a sponge. I'm a really good listener. And over time, I had to learn how to be a good talker, but I learned how to listen first. And it is incredibly important. There's nothing more rewarding than knowing that your nation is going to live on due to a little work that you got to put in, and that the communities look to us for that, give us platforms to be able to grow and maintain and continue our lifeways.
So you're somewhat bringing us full circle, because we talked about in the beginning how this is really about empowerment and continuation and sharing, and whether that's from what we've learned from our ancestors, from what we've learned from our elders, from what we're passing on to our children, and then modernizing it as well. So thank you for that. Great final thoughts. Professor Grande, any final thoughts on cultural preservation?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Certainly co-sign what Chris and Nakai have already said. And I think I would just add, they're talking about relationality in different ways. And that is definitely foundational to all our communities and peoples. But while we do this work for our communities and peoples, I just want to bring us back to also reciprocity, and that means it's an exchange. So it's not just again about who we are as peoples and communities, but what the loss or the ongoing kind of attempts to absorb and colonize our peoples and communities, how that impacts non-Indigenous communities. And so some of the biggest problems in the world today, whether it's climate change or loneliness, is suddenly. So when you build a culture around disconnection and severing, so people come into my classroom, they don't even know where their water comes from that they drink every day, so that they don't talk to students that they have classes with all day long. They always talk about, we just sit in rows and we absorb information. We don't exchange with each other. So, so it's not just kind of what's impacting our communities, but what are the issues in non-Indigenous communities right now? It's all about, I think, to me, suffering from disconnection, whether it's to our more than human relatives, disconnection from what people call resources, but really are our relatives, disconnection from each other, whatever is plaguing the world right now, homelessness, those are effects of a culture that is not ours. So what can we learn from each other? And everybody should support, I think, the strengthening and continuance of Indigenous peoples, that our society is built on relationality.
Thank you for that. So bringing back, what we've learned from generations prior to living in what we're living within, our modern world, and then how we're preparing for our 7 generations to come, whether it's something that was pre-colonial, colonialism, cultural genocide, or even, abduction, and our guidance and protocols, our laws, those sort of things. So making sure that we come together and connect as a people and connect within the families that we have and the communities that we have to actually make it a better place. So I want to thank everybody today for coming, and, make sure that, we have all these different perspectives, but it starts within you. It starts within, where are you starting within your cultural boundaries, within your foundation? And then what do you want to learn? As far as bringing it out into the world, whether it's through education, museums, our artists. We didn't talk a little bit about cultural art and that perspective, but where do you find those things and where do you want to attain those things? So I want to thank everybody for coming today. Wininakish Koatuank and Ka Aquani. Have a great evening. Have a great day.